Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are delighted you're joining our webinar today to talk about the 2021 Reg BI exams and the application of variable annuities. If you're not excited, I am. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement throughout today's conversation. Please use the chat box that's popping up on your screen here, and we have a lot of time at today's session, nearly 10 to 15 minutes to address any questions that you may have. And as with many of you, we are all working from home today, so you may hear some background noise and babies crying in the background, at least for me. So we appreciate your understanding in advance. Let's kick things off with a few introductions. We are excited to have an all-star lineup of industry experts in today's panel. I'll begin with introducing Matt Radgowski. He is the head of advisor solutions at Morningstar. Matt is responsible for Morningstar's advisor solution services in the US, while primarily focusing on Morningstar's license-based solutions, including research, data, software, and indexes. Matt also works closely with Morningstar's investment management and workplace offerings. Matt collaborates with corporate strategy and business unit leaders to identify market trends, analyze the solution portfolios, influence and shape product roadmaps, and lead go-to-market planning. Welcome, Matt. We also have Issa Hanna, who serves as counsel for Eversheds Sutherland. And Issa has over a decade of experience in securities and insurance law. Issa helps broker-dealers, investment advisors, investment funds, and insurance producers comply with regulatory requirements applicable to their businesses. Issa has a deep experience in counseling and advising clients on the evolving standards of conduct in the financial services space, and closely follows developments related to the SEC's regulation best interest rule, which we're going to cover today, the investment advisor fiduciary duty, and state securities and insurance laws. Welcome, Issa. Okay, our very own Dave Carprise, VP of Product Marketing at InvestorCom. For more than 20 years, I should say, Dave has successfully applied his innovative entrepreneurial spirit in helping financial organizations be compliant while focusing on the client experience. After a decade of partnering with InvestorCom, Dave joined our team as VP of Product and Marketing in 2017, where he continues to focus on delivering compliance pain relief through the development of innovative solutions in support of investor best interest mandates in regulations related to Canada and the US. And my name is Param Nasseri, VP of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCom. I will be your host for today's webinar. Welcome, everyone. Let's dive in. In today's session, we plan to cover, first, what firms and their compliance teams should expect from the expanded scope of the Reg BI examinations. Then we'll jump into why regulators are keen to see financial professionals assess investment costs and this notion of reasonably available alternatives when making recommendations. And we'll focus on best practices for meeting the care obligation when recommending complex investments such as variable annuities. Lastly, as I said off the top, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes available for any questions that you may have throughout today's session. Excellent. Let's start here because everybody likes timelines, and Issa, let's focus with you. One of the most commonly cited terms we've heard during the first 6 months of Reg BI has been the notion of good faith compliance. Can you walk us through what this has meant and how it's translated into practical implementation steps for the wealth management community?
Sure, happy to do that, Param, and happy to be here today. Thanks for joining us, everybody. So this notion of good faith compliance, I would say it can be traced back to a couple of things. There were some statements to that effect in 2 OC risk alerts that came out last April, where OC, now the Division of Examinations at the SEC, explained what they were going to be taking a look at as part of their initial round of Reg BI and Form CRS exams. It can also be traced back to a letter that Chair Clayton issued to the industry back in June of 2020, where he was responding to some industry requests that the compliance effective date for Reg BI and Form CRS be pushed back in light of disruptions caused by the pandemic. The SEC was, of course, sympathetic to those concerns that were caused by pandemic-related disruptions, so they were very much trying to work with the industry here. And they took an approach that was, I think, more collaborative in nature as opposed to adversarial. Hence the good faith efforts moniker for the approach that they took. And in terms of how good faith efforts were viewed at the time, back around the time when Reg BI and Form CRS first went effective, what were they looking for at that time? Well, they were looking for policies and procedures that were reasonably designed to meet Reg BI. They were looking for reasonable progress in implementing those policies and procedures. They did not expect to see full implementation or perfection in terms of the implementation. They were willing to work with firms on that. And then finally, in terms of, just from a comparative perspective, what they viewed as not good faith, if you were one of those firms, unfortunately, that didn't have policies and procedures in place, had policies and procedures that weren't tailored to your particular business, didn't conduct any gap analysis with respect to your disclosures, hadn't addressed or identified conflicts, really basic implementation issues, the SEC at that time would have said that's not good faith compliance. Fortunately, though, in the SEC's view, for the most part, the industry had met that good faith compliance standard at around that time.
Thanks, Issa. So following the initial set of good faith examinations, the SEC and FINRA hosted a roundtable on October 26. Can you expand on the SEC's comments around the care obligation and the difference between comparing a reasonable range of alternatives?
Sure. So during that roundtable on October 26, there were key staffers from the SEC and FINRA who spoke about key observations from that initial round of Reg BI and Form CRS exams that they promised in the 2 risk alerts that I mentioned up top. And during that roundtable, they spoke about common deficiencies they saw as part of that initial round of exams, but also some good practices they observed. In terms of common deficiencies, they highlighted a number of things, but there were 2 things they did mention that are relevant to the discussion that we're having here today. In terms of common things they observed, common deficiencies, they saw a lack of meaningful improvement in existing suitability-based policies and procedures. They saw that some firms were not training reps on which costs to consider and how to identify reasonably available alternatives. They specifically called that out. And then finally, one of the things that they mentioned also was that they noticed that some firms were solely relying on certifications, that reps were making best interest recommendations rather than adopting policies and procedures and providing meaningful training to reps about how to implement those policies and procedures. Those were common deficiencies that they saw that are relevant for purposes of our discussion today. In terms of good practices, they highlighted a number of things there too, but in terms of things that are relevant to our specific discussion today, they pointed to certain good practices. One that they mentioned was new systems to document recommendations and comparisons of available alternatives. They liked that. They liked it when they saw firms that were reviewing their overall product mix for costly outliers and eliminating those from the product mix, and also looking at the overall product mix to ensure that each product type had available alternatives. And then finally, the final practice I think that was that they mentioned that's relevant for purposes of our discussion today. They saw that certain firms were requiring their reps to take notes in their CRM around each recommendation to document compliance with the care obligation and provide supervisors a paper trail to monitor compliance. They like that practice as well.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, Issa, for that really extensive background on sort of what's been happening around this good faith nature and the examinations and some of the SEC findings. So let's sort of push forward to what happened following that October 26th roundtable, where the SEC issued an additional notice on what their Reg BI examinations in 2021 is going to focus on. Can you elaborate? Here we go. Can you elaborate on what the SEC's focus is going to be in the 2021 examination period?
Sure. So clearly, if you take a look at this December 21 letter, you come away with the impression that the tone and the content of the exams are going to be significantly different from the tone and the content of the initial round of exams. And they also happen to say that these exams might be starting as soon as this month, January 2021. To date, I haven't heard anything in particular, but they said that as part of the letter. They could be starting as soon as this month. Um, you know, as I mentioned up top, you know, in terms of good faith efforts, you know, they were really only expecting reasonable progress toward implementing Reg BI policies and procedures. In this letter, it looks like they're now looking for full implementation, especially with respect to 5 particular components of Reg BI that they say may be the subject of focus during this upcoming round of exams. Generally speaking, they're going to be focusing on the specific requirements of Reg BI that go beyond suitability standards and require broker-dealers to have a reasonable basis to believe that recommendations are in retail customers' best interest. And in terms of the specific requirements that they called out as possible areas of focus, the first that they focused on was adequacy of policies and procedures, and specifically whether those policies and procedures go beyond merely restating the requirements of Reg BI and include things like the what, the when, the who, the how evidenced, and how they're tested. Are firms considering costs in making recommendations? Do firms have processes that are being used to make recommendations to new customers, especially when making rollover recommendations? They're also going to be looking at the processes firms are using to recommend complex products, including what information is available to reps and how it's used to consider reasonably available alternatives. And finally, for good measure, they also called out conflicts, and they're asking what processes firms are using to identify and address conflicts of interest related to recommendations.
Thank you, Issa. That's a really helpful guidance in terms of what market participants should be looking out for during those exams. Let's zoom in on this notion that has come up throughout both the SEC's expanded scope of examinations and throughout today's conversation. You mentioned that the SEC is looking into whether and how costs and reasonably available alternatives were assessed. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what's the why behind this regulatory requirement? What will a financial professional accomplish by considering available alternatives?
Sure. So if you take a look at the Reg BI adopting release and what they say about this, this new supposed requirement, they say that as part of determining whether a broker-dealer has a reasonable basis to believe that a recommendation is in the best interest of the retail customer, a broker-dealer generally should consider reasonably available alternatives offered by the broker-dealer. In the SEC's view, such a consideration is an inherent aspect of making a best interest recommendation and is a key enhancement over existing broker-dealer suitability obligations, which do not necessarily require a comparative assessment among such alternatives. The SEC also says in the Reg BI adopting release that this concept already exists in the context of guidance regarding suitability and heightened supervision of complex product recommendations. In this prior FINRA guidance embodied in Regulatory Notice 1203, FINRA states that when broker-dealers are recommending complex or costly products, they should first consider whether less complex or costly products could achieve the same objectives for their retail customers. So in sum, the SEC thinks that by formalizing this prior guidance as part of Reg BI's care obligation, it will effectively be adding another key tool into its toolbox to help serve its overall investor protection goal of enhancing the broker-dealer standard of conduct from a suitability standard to a best interest standard. And you need look no further than that letter from December 21st that I mentioned up top to come to the conclusion that the SEC views this reasonably available alternatives consideration as a key tool in the investor protection toolbox. That letter lists 5 specific components of Reg BI that may be the subject of focus during this second round of examinations. And they included consideration of reasonably available alternatives in those 5 areas of focus, seemingly putting this priority on par with adopting and implementing reasonably designed policies and procedures, consideration of costs, rollover advice, and conflict management. I think that's an important thing to take away from that letter. They view this consideration of reasonably available alternatives as strong of a priority as things that are really also getting significant headliners here.
Thank you, Issa. I think if there's any takeaway from this message, it's to focus on that piece. Now, Matt, let me turn it over to you. Given this focus that we just talked about and the 2021 Reg BI exam priorities, what should be the general area of focus for the financial professional who will want to make a variable annuity recommendation?
Sure. Yeah. So, as we think about Reg BI through that lens of VA recommendations, cost, Issa mentioned cost a number of times. And I do think, you need to have an infrastructure to analyze those costs, right? The underlying investments as well as the products as a whole. And so just making sure that information is readily available, I think is key. Issa dug in as well on the notion of reasonably available alternatives, and also though considering alternatives that may not be VA oriented. And so there, I think, does create a situation where you need to understand the motivations of the end investor, their desire for secured income, such that you can then begin that analysis, right? If you have the information and data on the costs of the product, that VA product, as well as a process, right? Systematic process for recognizing that income needs are being addressed here. Again, I think you set yourself off on a good path in terms of being able to document best interests and supporting those comparisons as well.
Thanks, Matt. Let me flip it back to you, Issa, just quickly. One of the common questions we've heard speaking to our prospects, our clients, is does Reg BI's care obligation really apply to variable annuity recommendations?
Absolutely. Yes. There is a significant amount of discussion in the Reg BI adopting release of how Reg BI, generally speaking, applies to variable annuities. And this is no surprise. At the federal level, variable annuities are considered securities, and that goes back to an old Supreme Court case that establishes that variable annuities are effectively an investment contract under the federal securities laws. And generally speaking, Reg BI applies when you're making a recommendation of a security or an investment strategy to a retail customer. So that's the path that you would take to get to get to the conclusion that Reg BI does apply to recommendations of VAs.
Excellent. So VAs are covered under Reg BI. Matt, some would argue that given the number of VA features, they would be deemed as a complex product. How would you typically compare a VA recommendation to a mutual fund investment?
For sure. In my opinion, there's no question that they are in fact a complex product. And so, when we think about Reg BI in a mutual fund context, we think about performance, risk, and cost, right, as key variables in identifying alternatives and comparing. When you think about the variable insurance or variable annuity product, there is that investment dimension, right? And mutual funds, I would argue, are almost singular in that dimension. But there's two more dimensions that are added when you look at variable annuities. First and foremost, you have the product level features, right? Is it an immediate variable annuity? Is it a deferred variable annuity? There's certainly many other variants. But again, you have that product level cost features that you need to analyze, goodness of fit, right? And best interest in alignment with your client. At the next layer, there's a number of minimum withdrawal benefits, guaranteed benefits that can be bolted on riders effectively to that product as well, which adds another dimension. So kind of thinking about it in dimensions, you go from mutual funds where there's that singular investment dimension to now the product level dimension, as well as that additional rider or additional benefit dimension as well. Not to mention that while the mutual fund product can be used for capital appreciation, capital preservation, even capital disbursement, in order to understand that VA, you really need to you need to know something about that specific client, right? Is there a motivation, in fact, a desire for secured income? Within that desired income, just how secure does it need to be, right? And with that, then the analysis of these product and features becomes very important, right, in terms of demonstrating best interests. And so that does create a complexity for sure, in my eyes, around identifying what reasonably available alternatives are, and then again, evaluating them on that multi-dimensional front.
Thanks, Matt. So we've talked about sort of the notion of available alternatives, assessing the available alternatives, I should say, assessing costs. Let's talk about sort of why variable annuities to begin with. And Matt, there's been a lot of talk around the reemergence or prominence of VAs in the marketplace. Where do you see the use of such products going in the near future?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you think historically there were representatives that used annuities and representatives that did not, right? But if we think about the impact of this low interest rate environment that has been present for quite a long time, the idea that more investors really are now at that point in their life where they need the secured income. There's again I think a investment objective need to support the use of variable annuities within client portfolios. As we move beyond that, we've seen a shift, right? Just in terms of where those representatives are located. More broker-dealer affiliated advisors and representatives are moving to an independent model. And with that, they bring that experience, that utilization, that expertise around these products, and they bring that into the mix, right? We've also seen a lot of product improvements, historically speaking, and this is broad brush. Many had concerns just around the costs relative to benefits of these products. You've seen a lot of great innovation, fee-only annuities and things of that nature really coming front and center. And so I do think, we see VAs are a top 10 product within the BD market. You see that, they're being used by a number of investment advisors, about 15% today. I would certainly expect that to grow both based on movement of representatives across segment, but then again, this need for that secured income. And, I would actually maybe even make a small leap and say, or just question, right? Like, how implausible is it to say that at some point in time, from a regulatory perspective, is it going to be okay to say, look, I just don't sell those products, right? If they have a value and they have a need, they are in the best interest of that investor that has a very specific need for income. I do think at some point it could in fact become a situation where you could be, at risk for not looking out across all those alternatives and recommending. But I'm not an expert. I'd certainly love to hear Issa's thoughts on that statement if he's open to it.
No, I mean, I honestly agree with you, Matt. There's if you read the Reg BI adopting release closely, there's a fair amount of discussion about how a broker-dealer should go about constructing its retail customer investment platform. And generally speaking, the real goal that a broker-dealer should have in mind is, in a way, almost working backwards, right? Think about what their retail customers, what their most common needs are from a financial perspective, and trying to match your your platform to what your typical retail customer investment profile is. There's also a component of the care obligation that requires you as a broker-dealer to think about whether each and every product that you make available on your platform could be in at least some of your retail customers' best interest. But I think the inverse of that also applies, where you should be thinking about whether you have everything that you need to meet everything that could potentially come up as a need that your retail customers come to you with. And if you don't have something on your platform that could meet a particular need of many of your retail customers, what the SEC expectation is, if you're in that situation, they don't necessarily require you to add it, but they do say, if you come to the conclusion that you don't have what your customer needs, you have an obligation as a broker-dealer to effectively turn that customer away and say, I can't help you. You have to go to some other place to find what you need. Well, that's a nice thought. That's nice in theory, but the chances of that actually happening in practice, maybe I'm too cynical, seem unlikely. So I think you're better off having available to your reps everything that they could possibly need to recommend to their reps. And variable annuities, they have a particular purpose, and they're reasonable, and like to have that on your platform, I think is an appropriate thing to do given the specific purpose they serve.
Very much, guys. That's fantastic commentary on the importance and emergence of variable annuities. Dave, you've been super patient, so let me just ask you a few questions. Throughout today's conversation, Issa and Matt have described this need to consider reasonably available alternatives in that product recommendation process. Can you talk to our audience around how we solve for that particular need?
Well, the good news is we all know that we all know what the perfect solution is. It's easy. You put all the client information in with their goals and risk objectives, and out comes the best recommendation across all the different product types that Issa said they'll now have on their product shelves, and and it's the best fit for the client to achieve those goals. So it's pretty easy to draw that up. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist, and so when we look at that distinction between the reasonably available alternatives assessment versus suitability, we've really focused our solution on making that reasonably available alternatives part of the problem, trying to put some shape to that and make it doable from a principles-based regulation that's fairly open-ended and difficult to construct. I've developed a framework so that firms and reps can consistently go through that as part of a reasonable assessment of alternatives. And there's really two key aspects in our solution, or concepts, that make that or bring that to life. The one is a notion or a definition of peer groups. So making sure that by product type, there's a definition of what makes a product comparable to another. And then the second thing also is the ability, the consideration part of the reasonable alternatives. And again, by product, defining how it is a rep will determine what's in the client's best interest. So really that means what are the key dimensions, the key data points that a rep will look at to be sure her recommendations are within the guardrails as identified or defined within the policies and procedures of the firm.
Excellent, excellent. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, Dave, let me jump into the next question, which is, before taking us through a tour of our peer compare solution, can you mention a bit about what a rep needs to do on the documentation front of their analysis?
Yeah, and that's, good question. It's really, from our solution, it's really about integrating that piece of it. Too often it's a disjointed process where you're considering alternatives, then you go to that form, get out a pen or type, and you're filling out a template, just attesting to the fact that you've done that. And that ends up being very friction-filled, hard to enforce, hard to apply consistency. And so we've really taken a look, and I'll show you in a second, how to take that flow from the consideration of alternatives through that framework I was talking about, to archive that timestamp, the information the rep has looked at, memorialize it, say this is what the world looked at the time I made my recommendation, put some justification notes around that, and stick that all together within a record keeping piece. And actually, we've also created an option for client disclosure, not explicitly required, but certainly opens the door to kind of cover all bases if there are pieces that you'd like to pass on to a client as far as disclosure goes. And with that part, maybe the best way is I'll give you a very quick tour and respectful of time, but just to show some of those concepts about the components of the peer groups and the dimensions of comparison, bring those to life. If you don't mind me sharing my screen here, I'll give you a peek at how we've designed our peer compare solution to do that.
Dave, are you able to share?
I need you to stop sharing.
I have stopped sharing.
There we go. All right, so now you'll get a sense of our peer compare solution. And just to give you a quick peek at the framework, I'm going to pull up a mutual fund.
I hope Dave can hear us and come back.
Which arguably
There you are. You're back.
All right, sorry. The joys of working from home. So I was going to say, to start off, I'm going to grab a mutual fund and show how that peer group is set up in our demo system here for mutual funds. And then I'll flip to VAs to say how these concepts play themselves out according to product type. So I grabbed this mutual fund, and when we enter that, and we talked about the suitability is that separate set of conversations. Here we're doing the RIA piece of it. So I've grabbed a product, and then the peers, in this case, of our shelf of 25,000 mutual funds, we found 37 peers. And the way we define that is, they're all sector equity asset classes. They've got the category real estate, and they're all A-class shares. And within those 37, as you look at them, we compare them by the net expense ratio, their risk, and their returns. And obviously you can flip through them, but really by drilling down, this is really where that comparison comes in. And we've got a standard framework around, I call them the sliders, to say, how does this product stack up versus its peer group? So here we can say where we've got a low, high, and a midpoint. This particular product, it's good on the expense side. It's been less volatile than its peers, and it's slightly outperformed its peers. So this would be a great recommendation. So I'm going to flip to a VA now. So let's say I have a product in mind to recommend to a client around VAs. And this is where I'm taking that peer group idea and creating a different definition for the variable annuities. And in this case, for the purposes of our demo today, the peer group, the like for like groups are policies that are the same share class, the same rider type, and whether they're joint or single. And that's the way we've grouped it, and that they're open, which is kind of behind the scenes. And so, here we've seen, we found 400 matches within our shelf of over 24,000 VAs that we have on our product shelf. And when we drill down on this, again, similarly to the mutual funds, but configurable by product type, now our focus really is on fees to make the VA RIA comparison better. So we've got the annual fee, which is our M&A and E piece, our rider fee, and the max surrender fee. What's missing in our demo configuration today, obviously, is the cost of the sub-accounts. Again, these can be configured and added to that assessment. And the last piece I just want to flip to, Parm, if I've got some time here, is really that last question you had of, now that I've looked at how my product or my recommendation stacks up to its peers, I'm going to recommend it. And this is where you connect this activity to my client information, potentially create some justification reasons about what have I done here. So it's aligned with my client's risk tolerance. It's, supports a desired tax-deferred investment solution and their estate planning goals. And I may add some comments that, when I looked at did my fee assessment, it's compared favorably to its peers, and I want to complete that recommendation. And that's really that record-keeping aspect that takes a rep right through in a very standardized process, regardless of product type, to say, I'm going to compare, or I'm going to find a peer group, I'm going to compare how it stacks up according to predefined principles, and then I'm going to create that record-keeping option. And just to give a quick peek at, when we look at what record-keeping looks like and means, we know that in one place, I'm going to go to our Compliance Express reporting piece, where we can see now the history of recommendations that rep may have had. And I talked about the memorialization of this and capturing those notes. So in a case where you've emailed this out and actually done a disclosure, we keep timestamps of when it was sent, if it was opened and viewed by the investor. And we keep track of that artifact. So here's what we sent, a letter plus the details of that slider artifact. And whether you disclose or not, that's part of the record, in addition to any of the internal notes that we may have captured. So here, the fact that I've done my fee assessment and determined that it's reasonable versus its peers. So Parm, I'm going to kind of stop my quick tour through Peer Compare for that, but hopefully that gives the audience a bit of a sense of how we're taking those two concepts around peer groups and comparison dimensions to really deliver a straightforward workflow for reps to follow from comparison right through to record keeping, which is ultimately the thing that the assessor is going to look at when they show up. And with that, Parm, I'll turn it back to you for Q&A and anything else.
Thanks, Dave. And you surprise me every time at the pace at which you can go through a lot of our technology. Well done. Let me thank everybody for patiently listening in and engaging with us. Please send in your questions as we start the Q&A session here today. We clearly have an expert panel of industry expertise here who would be able to answer your questions. So let me just start things off. I've got a couple of questions coming in, and Dave, there's one question here for you. So are both the mutual fund reasonably available alternatives analysis and cost considerations and the same concept for VAs, are they both sort of kept within the same consolidated record keeping engine?
Absolutely. And so our record keeping engine, Compliance Express, is really designed to take a number of activities from many different sources, different product types, and put them all in one place to really remove some of that friction that, you know, this process of RAA seems to introduce into firms.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, Issa, maybe a question for you. With the nomination of the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, and Rohit Chopra leading the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, what can market participants expect on the Reg BI examination and enforcement front?
Sure. So, you know, I think you could just look at the December 21st letter and come away with an impression that things were about to change. And the second round of examinations is going to be, it's going to be tougher. They're going to be drilling down on, more key concepts and the key things that the SEC is pointing to as, kind of like the headliner aspects of Reg BI that enhance the standard of conduct as compared to the suitability standard that was the state of play, pre-June 2020. So, I think, again, you don't necessarily need to kind of look at what the incoming administration is, necessarily come away with a conclusion that things are going to get, tougher than just a good faith standard. But I think it's, probably fair to say that, the enforcement approach to Reg BI is going to be, pretty aggressive. There's probably going to be, a fair amount of, the dreaded regulation by enforcement that we're kind of used to on the investment advisor side now. And, down the line, after, the SEC, feels like it's collected a sufficient amount of information where they've got an idea of how Reg BI is operating, whether it's meeting their overall investor protection goals and enhancing that standard of conduct, you may see some tinkering around the edges with respect to Reg BI. Maybe they go forward with an effort to define exactly what best interest means. You might recall when Reg BI was initially proposed, there were some Democratic commissioners who were very upset that the proposal did not include a definition of best interest. Maybe they go that route down the line. Or, maybe they kind of lay out other kind of key definitional or, concepts that define specific standards as opposed to leaving things more vague. But at this point, it's kind of too hard to tell whether that's going to come to pass.
Thanks, Issa. Okay, we've got another question from Stephen. Maybe this is directed towards you, Dave, and possibly Matt. What are the data sources for your peer group analysis? That's
a great question. And again, thanks, Matt, for the partnership that you and Morningstar have had and exhibited thus far with InvestorCom. So Morningstar is obviously a fairly significant partner with us. I think we're technically, we can get data from any number of sources. And as we look at onboarding different product types, it's really scouring and looking for some reliable data sources to do that. And Morningstar has been a fairly important partner at doing that. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Matt.
The only thing I would add there is, as it relates to the variable annuity data, that's certainly complex, right? We talked about the levels, product, rider, investment. And so We do collect data directly from the product manufacturers, and so good, strong relationships with the insurers that provide these products, and they do open up and give us a lot of information and data, not only about current products, but important to this type of analysis in many cases is products that have been retired. I understand the complexities of that within all of your systems out there, and so we rely on direct data gathering from insurers as it relates to VA as well.
Matt, since you got the mic, one more hot question coming your way. So if part of the recommendation of a VA is the rider, how do you compare those beyond the costs?
Yeah, so other considerations you want to make are just the type of rider itself, right? Is it a GLWB? Is it a GMWB? Is it a GMAB? And so GMIB, right? So you want to make sure that the rider type, right, is consistent. The other thing is things like the cost, of course, but also the crediting rates around those guarantees, I think are important. You certainly want to make sure that, again, the cost of that rider relative to the level of income it's going to guarantee, both on the balance side and then the crediting rate on the income side. Those are other considerations you'll want to make as it's related to that VA product.
Okay, thanks, Matt. We've got another question, and maybe I'll tackle this. It says, does the comparison tool also compare alternatives, i.e. REITs, business development corporations, Reg B products from Alex? So we can't demo it in this instance for you, Alex, but the same principle of comparing available alternatives predicated on a peer group concept or a matching concept can also be applied to alternative products. And so maybe I'll leave the answer at that. Does anybody else want to tackle that one? Going once. Sounds good. Okay, I've got a question for you, Issa. A common question we've heard is around the degree of documentation that's required from a Reg BI perspective, and given that the examinations are going to be sort of expanded to a degree, as we talked about earlier, what would you believe to be sort of an appropriate step as firms kind of consider this notion of documenting their analysis going forward?
Sure. So, there's some guidance in the Reg BI adopting release that you can look to on this question of documentation. The SEC has said there are certain types of recommendations that are especially sensitive and, thus would kind of, from a risk-based perspective, it would be a good idea to document the basis for those recommendations just as a best practice. And, the things that they point to shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to folks. They're going to be rollover recommendations, account type recommendations, those kind of real life cycle type recommendations. And then recommendations of complex products, especially risky products, especially costly products, those types of things. The SEC and the Reg BI adopting release, it really encourages folks to document the basis for those recommendations. But it doesn't necessarily say in that adopting release that you should be, documenting the basis for every single recommendation. Then, in that October 26th roundtable, they were talking about a number of different good practices that they observed. And one thing that they specifically called out during that roundtable as a good practice, something that they admired, was when they saw firms that were requiring reps to take notes in their CRM around each and every recommendation to document compliance with the care obligation and provide supervisors a paper trail to monitor compliance. So, you put this all together and you kind of come to this conclusion that, one of the most, significant enhancements in your typical broker-dealer's compliance program to respond to Reg BI is to really make use of heavy documentation to meet that care obligation under Reg BI.
Thank you very much, Issa, and thank you to everybody who's attended, and a big time thank you to our panelists. What we tried to talk about today is sort of the general impetus behind this expanded scope of the SEC's Reg BI examinations. And so given our conversation today, we'd welcome the opportunity to explore how we can help you as we march ahead in the given year and the expanded scope of the Reg BI examinations. Thank you all for attending. We are just on time at 1:45 p.m. on the dot. Have yourselves a great afternoon.